I'm going to ask a question that I think's been on a lot of people's minds when reading Chainsaw Man. What the hell is Fujimoto doing right now? Confusion and disappointment in the direction of Part 2 seems to have been prevalent in the community and myself now for quite a long time. Tatsuki Fujimoto has always been an unpredictable and unorthodox writer by all normal standards, but since the Falling Devil arc, Chainsaw Man doesn't just feel erratic, it feels aimless and kind of stale, contrary to how I felt about it for quite a while now. Chapter 167 and the discourse surrounding that was so divisive that today I want to get to the bottom of what seems to be causing this boredom and general distaste for the direction of Chainsaw Man recently. Fujimoto is definitely taking a different approach to writing a story now than he has in the past, but before assigning total blame to the content and quality of Chainsaw Man in its current state, I think it's extremely important to make known many of the differences in reading experience for myself and many current readers relative to how we consumed much of Part 1. If you're anything like me, most of your initial Chainsaw Man viewing experience was binged. I myself binge read Chainsaw Man up until the last arc of the story, which I then read weekly until its conclusion. After this, and giving myself some time to mull over how I felt, I gave the manga a reread a few months before the Chainsaw Man anime dropped, and enjoyed the entire story even more so upon revisiting it. Binging this manga allowed me to read at a pace set solely by myself, and as such, I could go through any mundane or exciting parts of the story as slowly or quickly as I wanted, giving myself time to digest some of Fujimoto's choices and really think about a lot of what Chainsaw Man was about. The people reading the manga right now don't have that luxury in a lot of ways. Not only is it impossible to read the complete story of Chainsaw Man Part 2 at this point in time, but Fujimoto's current work schedule is structured to prioritize his health and personal comfortability more so than keeping up with the intense and honestly unstable weekly release schedule that is standard with Shonen Jump. While some chapters may drop within a week of each other, it's not that rare that we go a few weeks without Chainsaw Man only to get a 15-page chapter and then go on another 2-week break. For the sake of Fujimoto's sanity and health, this timetable works best, but for fans who fell in love with Chainsaw Man's bombastic and dramatic approach to storytelling, it doesn't translate quite as well, which means that even if the story was told in the exact same way as it was in Part 1, many fans, including myself, would be less inclined to get the same rush of excitement chapter to chapter as we did in the past. Now, this doesn't inherently discredit Chainsaw Man's quality or Fujimoto's ability as a writer, but it's undeniable that these factors are contributing to the general apathy, disinterest, or even dislike for the goings-ons of the manga right now. That being said, if ongoing manga fatigue was the only thing that I found had impacted my reading experience, I wouldn't have even bothered making this video. Any series, even those that drop chapters on a weekly basis, are subject to their viewers experiencing fatigue from the structure of reading it in that way. What exacerbates the issue in Chainsaw Man for me and many others is twofold. The contents of each chapter leaves much to be desired, and the visual distinctness that Chainsaw Man is known for has all but disappeared. Now, I'll start with the art because my point is much easier to demonstrate in that category, and to put it simply, Chainsaw Man does not look as good now as it did 100 chapters ago. The line art is less varied, the character expressions are more warped and less emotionally compelling, any and all compositional excitement has been drained, and all we are left with is the bare bones of Fujimoto's very loose style without any of the benefits and drama that came with it. I know this can come off as really harsh or even shallow to care so much about the art of a story like Chainsaw Man, but the medium of manga and sequential storytelling in an overarching sense is so special because of its blend between story, character, and visuals. A manga without art can't even be called a manga, so in my mind, the art for a series like Chainsaw Man having such a fall from grace is just as notable and nearly as important as a decline in character and story quality. For someone like Fujimoto, who's always enhanced his stories through the nature of his artistic choices, this flaw becomes even harder to ignore, especially because Chainsaw Man Part 2 wasn't always illustrated in such a lukewarm way. Denji vs. the Cockroach Devil was an amazing display of artistic prowess on Fujimoto's part, and all of the assistants on his team aiding him in creating this horrifically epic battle between devils deserves a round of applause. There is a very obvious amount of care and attention to detail placed in every stroke of the pen, and even the paneling feels so much clearer and easier to read than where we are right now. Despite the fighting being so chaotic in very Fujimoto fashion, I'm able to see what's going on very clearly and precisely, and never feel like I have to fight the manga to piece together what's going on. Contrast this with chapter 152, where the action is not only significantly less exciting and smaller in scale, lacking much of Fujimoto's signature punch, but the choreography and sequence of events is much more difficult to follow. It's harder to tell exactly who's doing what because the pages are so busy and cluttered. So rather than feeling like a beautiful, chaotic mess, it feels like a muddy, dirty clash between henchmen. Maybe you could argue that that's the intent of the fight here, but even with that being considered, I think it lacks a lot of the usual vigor we'd see in Chainsaw Man's old fights. Even more mundane scenes where characters are just emoting or speaking feels so much smoother and more refined in earlier parts of Chainsaw Man compared to where we're at in the manga right now. On its own, the pretty stark drop in artistic quality would be a decent enough reason to feel that Chainsaw Man is a less refined and complete experience now than it has been in a while. But when combined with the fact that the character writing and plotting recently hasn't been hitting for much either, and well, you definitely don't get a recipe for a super fun reading experience. The Church of Chainsaw Man arc is really emblematic of what I'm talking about. Conceptually, this piece of the story could have really been one for the books. A cult being created with Denji, or rather Chainsaw Man as the focus, and all of the drama that would come from both protagonists is just salivating. Denji being unable to transform into Chainsaw Man, something that in part 2 especially has been depicted as a release for him. Asa being thrust into the public eye because of Yoru and her abilities. Linking these two things together by the end of the arc dramatically in a way that would forever change the dynamics and interactions of these two characters, all while introducing a solid sidecast that could become a mainstay for this portion of Chainsaw Man's journey. In my mind, that's what the Church of Chainsaw Man had to offer in theory. Unfortunately for me, the theory was disproved and dismantled rather quickly. An arc that spanned 23 chapters had very few super moving or exciting scenes to me. This isn't to say that it was completely devoid of any interesting or thought-provoking content. Denji's relapse upon his transformation into Chainsaw Man was narratively spectacular, if a bit lacking in the visual department, and the conclusion to the arc felt very Fujimoto-esque in the way that it was delivered. Despite having moments of genius though, I can't say I've come away from that arc entirely interested or pleased with what we got. Every member of the Church of Chainsaw Man itself is relatively uninteresting. The characters I care about now are basically the same ones I cared about since the beginning of part 2, and that is just disappointing, to be completely honest with you. Asa, Yoru, Denji, Nayuta, and Yoshida are the characters that make up most of my investment, with no one else, especially any antagonistic forces, leaving much of an impression on me that surpasses a palpable shoulder shrug feeling. Even moments where Denji is going through events that are mundane but important for his character arc, they don't hit the way you'd want them to, because you got someone like Fumiko leading the charge on that. No shade to Fumiko, I guess. But the most memorable thing about that girl is her weird ass stare. Everything from her backstory to disgust with Chainsaw Man just bores me to tears and makes any interaction between her and Denji fundamentally less engaging on both ends. This general apathy bleeds directly into the Chainsaw Man rescue arc, and man, where do I even begin with this portion of the story? When I ask that question, I'm not even being hyperbolic or dramatic. I'm genuinely reflecting and thinking about this mid-recording just because this whole experience kind of feels like a nothing burger. I wouldn't say that this arc sucked so much as it's just a whole lot of nothing. From a raid perspective, this arc is extremely plain. Part of its simplicity comes from the fact that Fujimoto doesn't seem interested in getting into a cinematic bag right now, but another part just comes from this whole ordeal being played so goofily. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not an enemy of all things goofy, silly, and wacky, but I don't think it's really played that well in this arc, and a lot of the gags Fujimoto has been throwing out recently just do not hit home. Chainsaw Man has always been a story about serious things, often being undercut by very dark or physical comedy. I have no delusions about that. I've even enjoyed that in the past, so I can't say that it's a problem in its idea, but god damn man, seeing this entourage of idiots just waltz through this super heavily guarded facility is dull at best and aggravating at worst, solely because I think this could have been a really good set piece for Asa and Yoru to show off their new power in a big way. Asa does show off how insane she is and how much her abilities have grown in the beginning of the raid by hijacking the turrets or whatever, but I don't leave this encounter being in awe of her power, despite the setup for the arc pretty blatantly being about how difficult breaking into this facility would be. This disappointment continues with many plot points or reveals that we get in this arc. Asa finding out Chainsaw Man was Denji, something we've been building up to for like the entire part of the manga, whack. I don't mind this reaction being comedic, because that's just Fujimoto's style, but damn brother, I'm gonna need you to lock in for a second with these drawings if you're not going the super emotionally sincere route. Otherwise, the visual comedy falls flat because the visuals aren't great. Kwang Shi showing up, also whack. No spectacle, no flair, no super crazy insight, just her showing up because it makes sense to and nothing else. She does drop a really cool bar about Denji being a more fearsome opponent than her, and that's cool, but there just really isn't much to speak of in regards to her or the rest of the arc. It wasn't bombastic or entertaining when I shut my brain off, and when I turned my brain on, I realized the only characters on screen that I even remotely care about are Asa, Yoru, and kinda Fami, and she barely qualifies. And even with Asa and Yoru, I don't feel like they grew or had much in the way of genuine characterization in this entire arc. As of the recording of this video, the next arc seems to be focusing on the fallout of the prison break and Church of Chainsaw Man arcs, so I can't and won't say anything too definitive on it considering that it's currently incomplete, but so far I'm not really moved by what Fujimoto's writing right now. Katana Man is so unfunny and boring to me in his utilization currently, and the kicking Denji in the balls jokes were not cutting it for me. There was one really good chapter where it's clear Fujimoto wanted to bring the consequences of the prior events into focus, and when he did this, I felt a genuine spark of hope and excitement because that tone, that approach, that style of presentation is a large part of what I look for in any given Chainsaw Man chapter. Was it partially undercut by Katana Man suggesting they go alleviate some stress? Sure, I guess, but I'm no prude, and I've accepted that that's just Chainsaw Man. The following chapter, unfortunately, is much less interesting, leading us to chapter 167, which by the time I release this video will probably be followed by a new one, and that chapter was very, very divisive. I completely understand why people are reserved in regards to what happened in this chapter, especially if you're someone who's experienced a trauma like this yourself. My main hope is that we really shift gears and get into a bit more serious territory in addressing this, simply because there are many ways this could go poorly if Fujimoto does not have both hands tightly on the wheel. It doesn't mean all jokes and funnies gotta disappear, but Fujimoto, if you're gonna explore this trauma, I'd appreciate seeing it be explored in earnest. That's something only future me will be able to comment on though. Generally speaking, a lot of Chainsaw Man, arguably in this last year or so, has just been a very weird experience and oftentimes painful slog for a multitude of reasons. The series has fewer characters than ever that I care about on screen. Their development and dynamics seem to have stagnated a while ago. The already slow pacing becomes brutal with the introduction of 2-week breaks between chapters. The plot is very average right now, and much of Fujimoto's visual flair has disappeared into thin air. To say Chainsaw Man fell off may not be something I want to put on this series quite yet, but I will say that the manga is certainly in a rough patch. Time will tell if all of this was building up to something greater, or if this aspect of Chainsaw Man just won't be able to live up to its debut. All in all, for me, Chainsaw Man Part 2 has just been really confusing and really disappointing. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more analysis, maybe with a bit more optimism and praise, check out my Blue Lock and Kagurabachi videos. These are two ongoing series that have my full support and I think are basically doing everything right. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.